everyone. My antique shoe collection is now over 50 pairs. I don't know when this officially becomes a museum, but it's starting to feel like one. About 1/3 of those are ladies' boots, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity to show you the wide variety of boot styles that women had throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Of course, in terms of women's boots in European and Western wear, they are not terribly popular until we reach the 19th century. So you'll find things like riding boots in the 18th century, but they're very unusual. It's definitely something that's more for the upper classes, and in fact, most of the time when you see depictions of women riding horses, they're still wearing regular shoes. And so boots weren't really the universally popular thing that we are used to today just yet, but that started to change in the early 19th century for everyone. In particular, ladies started wearing boots for walking. Walking became a very popular hobby for ladies, and shoes of that era were increasingly light and thin, very little coverage, no heels, no thick soles, so they weren't always the most practical shoes for walking, or just really any sort of inclement weather, or just most day-to-day things. So boots started to become very popular. They were very short, usually just over the ankle, and very often laced up over the front of the foot. These were still very lightweight in most cases, very thin leather, very thin fabrics, but it was just enough coverage to get by. And it's with this style of boot in mind that we pick up with the 1840s, because not a terrible lot changed between 1800 and 1840 in terms of boot styles, aside from a few little stylistic changes like moving the lacing to the side. So the first shoe that I want to introduce you to is this lovely shoe from likely the mid to late 1840s. And this shoe is a side lacing boot, which was a very popular style in this era. They picked up in popularity in the late 1820s and continued to be popular well into the 1860s. This is a great example of the era that it's from and the fact that it's still very lightweight. And you're going to find not only examples in nice silks like this, but also I have another example that's very similar from right around the same time period, and it's a much sturdier wool. So that pair is much more functional and practical than, say, this lovely figured silk. We can also see the differences when we look at the sole of these shoes. The black silk pair has a bit more decoration going on. In general, the leather looks a little bit finer quality. It's not as wrinkled, it's a lot smoother, and the edges are cut much more finely. Though these are constructed in exactly the same way, every single stitch done by hand, the main part of the shoe assembled by stitching as well, it really comes down to a very slight difference in quality. You'll also notice that both pairs of these shoes are right and left. This is the point where we start to see a transition away from the straight last styles of the 18th and very early 19th centuries to working towards right and left again. This is not a universal overnight change and will actually take decades for that to really become the norm. And the shoes that we see it with first are the boots that button or lace on the sides, so they're right and left already. So at this point in time, we're going to see a mix. You'll also notice the fact that though the uppers are made mostly of silk, there are little sections called foxing of leather. So at both the toe and the heel areas where they're going to get a lot of wear and tear, we bump our toes and scratch our heels on steps and things like that, that there's a little bit of leather there that's more durable and more repairable, so that way they can last a little bit longer. We can find a slightly different style of leather work on this 1850 pair of side lacing boots. Not much has changed. The toe is actually a little bit squarer in shape. We sort of go back and forth over the decades here, but the leather surrounds the entire shoe and is closer to what they call a galoche style of leather application. I also really love the fact that the leather and all of the seams are not finished with top stitching like I'm used to seeing with a back stitch, but instead have a little herringbone stitch over them. So lovely little decorative element to this. I also want to point out that though this shoe is rather faded and more of a dull blue at this point in time, these sections that are protected on the tongue and elsewhere show us that this was actually a very vibrant purple to begin with. It's just faded with exposure to weather and sun over the years. But not a lot has changed over the roughly 10 years of difference between these shoes. Skipping forward about 20 years, we're now moving into the mid-1860s, and this is one of my favorite pairs. This boot is definitively from 1867, and I can tell that because it actually has a really special stamp on its sole, and that is noting that it's from the Exposition Universelle, which took place in Paris in 1867, which is essentially a World's Fair. This particular pair of shoes was made by Fortier, which was a very popular shoemaker in France at the time, and though it's not likely that this pair of boots was actually in the exposition, but rather a copy of a style that was, they are still an absolutely exquisite pair and a great example of high fashion during this time. This pair of boots still has that slightly squared toe that we saw on the earlier examples, but it does now have a heel. Heels actually start to come back after the first great exhibition in 1851 that took place in London. And this style of heel is a knock-on heel, so it's actually made up separately and then glued and nailed into place. This pair of boots is also a Congress boot style, which became really popular in the late 1840s. And it's a style that we still see being sold today. With the elastic panels on the side, it means that you don't need buttons or laces in order to fasten the shoe snugly over your foot. It makes it really easy to function, as well as a great example of modern technology. Elastic was still a very new thing at that time, and as exemplified by the fact that the elastic on this has completely shattered apart and died, it's still not exactly in a long-term perfect state. We can see a couple of little straps to pull on the elasticated boot, as well as some nice little decorative elements like a rosette and tassels in front. The vast majority of this shoe, interestingly enough, is also machine stitched when it comes to the uppers. There's a little bit of hand stitching done, and the shoe itself is still stitched together by hand, but we are starting to see a little bit of transition in technology as well as movement in style. Fashionable and high technology examples like this boot were something that would have been very prevalent in all of the world's fairs throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In large parts, those events are made up of a whole bunch of tradespeople showing off the best work that they could possibly do. Essentially, a showcase of the highest quality goods. And speaking of high quality goods, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor for this week's video, Brooklinen. Brooklinen has a wide range of luxury home goods focusing on high quality textiles. And their luxury goods don't come with an over-the-top luxury price. I've actually been buying my sheets, bedding, and towels from Brooklinen for almost a decade, discovering them when I went looking for better quality options that would actually last. Natural fibers and good quality textiles have always been an important part of my life, especially my bedding. And Brooklinen has lots of different textile options so you can get the best sheets for your life. I got the classic hardcore bundle, which not only has the core sheet set, but all extra pillowcases and a duvet cover, and you save 25% over individual items that way. The classic style is a 270 thread count per KL cotton. It is so crisp and smooth and breathable. And the best part is the fact that they actually match my room. I love changing out my bedding for the different seasons with new color combinations, and to find a color that actually matches my walls is really exciting. You can mix and match over 20 colors and patterns, and they're always introducing new and exciting options for the season. So head on over to the site to play around with creating a new and fresh design. Brooklinen is offering my viewers $20 off any order over $100. Just click the link below or use the code. Thanks again to Brooklinen for sponsoring this week's video. Another great example from the 1860s is this pair of boots, though it's not the most fashionable pair. It's a great example of a healthy shoe, or at least what they considered a healthy shoe for the period. They had a lot of concerns over foot health and the fact that they thought it could cause consumption, tuberculosis, or all sorts of other illnesses. So they recommended things like a very low heel, something under 1.5 inches, which this is, but it will help keep the foot elevated out of the water and off of the cold ground. They also recommend a much heavier sole. This actually has a double sole under the foot. It's not a welt, instead it's just literally 2 layers of thick, heavy leather that they've stitched through. There's also extra stability in the heel cup and back, as well as over the toe. There's a bunch of structure built there to elevate the height of the toe, so that way there's plenty of room for your own toes within the shoe. They are still in the older side lacing style, but this does mean that they are going to be pretty secure over the top of the foot, as well as holding the ankle in place. And in general, these shoes will be fairly water resistant and fairly warm in comparison to a lot of the popular styles of the day. Next, we're going to skip ahead roughly another 20 years again to this pair of boots from the early 1880s. This is again another lovely fashionable example, and it is another French example as well. This pair of shoes was made by J. Petit, who interestingly enough made the pair of 1864 boots that I copied for my master's thesis. So I'm already very familiar with this maker and the quality of their work, but this pair of boots is a little bit later than that 1864 pair, coming into the 1880s. We've moved away from that square toe for the most part. It's not an almond toe yet, it's just more rounded than square at this point. Interestingly enough, this pair is still straight last, so again, as I noted, the right-left style hadn't really become the standard in all shoes until closer to the 1890s from what I've been able to find. This pair is made out of a very shiny black leather, which is a really trendy option in the time, and you can see all the lovely cut-out work in front. This is another popular style that picks up in the 1870s with all of this cut work and bead work and the lacing up the front in order to really showcase very fashionable shoes as well as fashionable stockings. So you can imagine just how lovely a colorful pair of stockings would be flashing through all of these openings. The heel on this is a rather practical height and practical size for this era. In fact, this is likely an evening boot meant for dancing and spending long evenings on your feet, so a sturdy lower heel like this is absolutely perfect and would have been a really popular option during this time. Though sewing machines are pretty much the standard of most construction by this time, there is still a fair amount of handwork in this, not just from the beads, but also from the fact that all of these edges are actually stitched over by hand with a buttonhole stitch. So there is a lot of handwork put into this pair of shoes, despite all of the advancements that we're making in machines to not only stitch the uppers as well as the entire shoe. There's still a lot of effort put into handwork for many of the shoes made during this time. And of course, not all styles of shoes are moving forward so fast in this time that we've forgotten them. Like I mentioned before, the Congress boot, still very popular style today, and it was so in the 1890s as well. One of the really popular styles that comes about in the early to mid 1890s is called a Juliet boot, or sometimes Juliet shoe. Sort of in between what we would think of a boot and a shoe. It still has the elastic on the sides that we're used to seeing from those Congress boots, and is sometimes referred to as a Juliet Congress boot for that matter. And this is a great indicator of the 1890s with its low heel, and in this case, not fully long pointed toe, but definitely getting there. Obviously, this pair has not seen much, if anywhere. It is marked at the toe as a size 4, which is close to an American 6 today. The construction technique of this is probably all glued together from the looks of it. The uppers, of course, are machine stitched in what is a glazed kid. You can also see that the lining of this is not exactly finished very well. It's just kind of left raw around all the edges. This is not a shoe that was constructed with a great deal of expert care, but is pretty mass-produced. So this is meant to be a very sturdy, functional shoe. Of course, we can't move forward into the 1890s without taking a look at the most typical style of 1890s shoes from the middle part of that decade. A really low heel and a very long pointed toe. The toe here just keeps growing and growing in length. I do want to note the fact that this is not making it smaller and smaller for women's toe space, just getting longer and longer. They are going for a very narrow looking foot at this time, so the longer the shoe, the more narrow the foot looked. It's a bit of deception, but this is an exquisite example of the typical style for that mid-1890s point, with not only the general shape that we're looking for, the just above ankle height front laced with a combination of both a practical fabric and leather. We have a little bit of extra top stitching done and some extra design work with that leather as well. It's a fairly decorative piece, though still very practical. Shoes like this would have been wonderfully popular with women who were getting out and being more active. They're not necessarily meant for sporting, but they are definitely meant for walking and a more active life. Things like bicycling, for example, were becoming immensely popular during this time, and boots like this were one of the best options for that. Of course, just like our shoe styles constantly change today, the pointed toe and low heel were not going to stick around for a terribly long time. By the point where we reach the turn of the century and move into the early 1900s, we start to see a much higher heel and a much more rounded toe. The pointed toe doesn't entirely go away, but it does become less popular for quite a few years there. This pair of shoes is made out of a red silk satin, and all of the edges were originally bound in a red silk ribbon, though it's worn down to just the beige portion of the ribbon at this point, but that wasn't originally its intention. It has 8 faceted buttons to close it over the top of the foot and up around the ankle, again utilizing that earlier style that we saw of all the open work to really show off the stockings. There are certainly closed button boots in this era. That's probably one of the most common styles that you'll find, but open work like this is also very fashionable. And there's also a tiny little extra bit of decoration with some steel beads at the top of the foot. The heel itself still not too terribly high in comparison to what we're used to for our modern day, but definitely slowly increasing in height and slowly increasing in everyone's concern. That high heel was about to take off to some surprising new proportions. However, by the 19-teens, really high heels, much more closely related to what we're used to seeing today, are incredibly popular. So this very curvy French heel style is close to around 3 inches high, and we've now also moved back into that much longer pointed toe as well. This is really indicative of the mid to late 19-teens. I actually have more than one pair of boots from this era with very similar heel and toe shape. The decorations on the upper portion of the shoe are also really indicative of the era. They love to play around with contrasts as well as other decorative things. Sewing machines are, of course, the standard not only for the uppers by this point, but also for the shoes themselves. We've moved away from hand stitching shoes together to now doing all of our stitching on things like maquet machines or all sorts of other shoemaking stitching machines, or just simply gluing everything together. All very popular methods that allow us to very rapidly assemble a pair of shoes. So shoes are becoming much more mass-produced by this point, to say the least, which also means that we're going to more typically see sizes associated with them in the inside of the shoes as well. We standardized sizes for shoes back in the 1870s, and so it's going to be pretty typical to find a little size printed inside. Now, those have changed over the years, so they may not be the size that you are familiar with today, but things have standardized themselves to be much more familiar to us as our modern shoes. Of course, front lacing boots are still very much one of the most popular styles in this era, despite the wide variety of different options that you have for decorative styles. And there are certainly still button boots. I actually do have a pair of button boots from right around the same era, same sort of shape of heel and toe. So these are still available at this time, but we're going to start seeing changes from that more Victorian style of boot very quickly once we reach the 1920s. One of my favorite examples of the early 1920s in my collection will always be this pair of what they call Russian boots. And this was meant to be a response to the galoshes that were very popular during this time, but usually buckled across the ankle. And if you just simply slipped your foot into them, it took a fair bit of time to buckle them up and close them up. So this style of shoe was meant to be much more enclosed and easy to wear, though you do still have to do the buttons here. There are plenty of variations on the style that don't have any closures. And this didn't last terribly long as a fashionable style, but it was really popular for the few years that it was around and really helped move the new styles forward. You can see a much sturdier, larger heel here, as well as a much rounder toe comparison to what it had been previously. It's a very comfortable and easy to wear shoe. I actually made a reproduction of these a couple of years ago. That is one of the most comfortable pairs of shoes that I own, and if you want to see more about this pair, I recommend checking out that video. And as we head further into the 1920s, we start seeing more and more of those sturdy Cuban heels, as they're called, a really straight structural style of heel and a much rounder toe. Now, this pair of boots has definitely seen better days. It has been worn to somewhere and back, that's for sure, and definitely saw quite a few rainstorms and probably ended its life at the point where it could no longer be reshaped into what it should be as a shoe. So this was definitely a very well-loved pair of boots and a great example of how we updated a lot of older styles to work for the 1920s. So it's still a pair of button boots. It still has a lot of that open work style that we're used to seeing, but the height of the boot has gone down from the earlier 1900s styles, and the overall shape and style of the boot has moved on from that really extreme curvy Edwardian shape that we saw earlier. Last in our timeline of regular boots is this pair from the late 1920s or early 1930s. So it's continuing to transition with a slightly higher, smaller heel, but still very straight edged rather than that curvy French style we saw earlier. The toe is very rounded and is actually lifted a little bit in height. So the overall look of this shoe is much softer and rounder than a lot of the earlier styles that have much more extreme curves. The bottom of this shoe is also much wider at the waist, and in general a little bit more conservative styling in a way. You still see a lot of the open work and the lacing that we saw before, but the open work has now extended much further around the shoe to the point where this is almost more sandal than boot. It's not exactly going to keep you dry in wet weather, but regardless, the women that wore these definitely wore them quite a bit. They've been worn down so you can actually see the maquet stitch showing here, which is a looped stitch or chain stitch instead of a regular stitch by hand. That type of shoemaking construction is still really popular in this era, even though we moved into these more modern styles. This is also a great time to point out one of the major differences between the older styles and this more recent 1930s. I can't really put any sort of flex into the shoe. It's very stiff. The entirety of the shoe is built up with extra structures of leather that reinforce it, and there is likely a steel shank down the arch of the shoe that helps support that curve. If we go back to one of our earlier pairs, they don't have a metal shank in there. They instead might have a leather shank or even one that's built up out of cardboard, but they don't need something that is that stiff because they don't have a really tall height yet. So these earlier shoes are going to be much more flexible and soft than this later style. Of course, these are not the only types of boots that were available during these eras. Not only were there huge ranges of different styles and variations on each element in order to make sure that everyone managed to get a style that they actually liked and were comfortable in, there's also one major trending style through the whole period that is sort of a boot, but not quite. And that is the case of galoshes, or sometimes called overshoes, which are shaped like boots but are actually meant to slip over a pair of shoes, so that way it protects them from the weather, keeps your foot dry and warm, but you don't have to completely change out your shoes every time. A great example of this in my collection is this pair of overshoes, which is likely from the early 1880s. This is actually a rubber pair down at the bottom, and the upper portion is a wool knit, which would have also done really well to keep you warm and dry. It's really hard to actually put a date on these particular styles of shoes because they don't change quite as rapidly or clearly as the shoes that would have gone inside of them, but this does still have a bit of a square toe. The little rosette on the top of the foot is really typical for the 1860s, 70s, and into the early 80s. If we look at the bottom, you can not only see the size stamps, but you can also see that it says Goodyear's Rubber Manufacturing Company, New York, which has its own little sordid story in the fact that this is not the Goodyear company that we are used to today. In fact, this company was part of a very large legal battle that took place in the Supreme Court. This is actually the Goodyear Rubber Glove Manufacturing Company. It doesn't say glove, it just has a little glove on it. And they were being accused by the original Goodyear's company of essentially trying to mislead customers into believing that they were the same company. Interestingly enough, they said that you can't actually patent the name Goodyear because that's the person that figured out how to vulcanize rubber. That was an invention that that person came up with, but you can't really patent that name in the same way. So that was a really important legal battle that took place over this exact company of shoes. And the company continued well after the legal battle in the 1880s and continued to sell shoes all the way up through at least the 1920s. And shoes like that weren't the only type of overshoe that were available. We also have the infamous carriage boots that were incredibly popular during the latter half of the 19th century and even into the 20th century. This style is from Cameyers, which is a really popular shoe brand that's based out of New York, and they lasted for quite a few years as well. This style we know was sold in the 1890s as well as through the 1900s and maybe even into the 19-teens, though likely this pair is from around the turn of the century point. And this is made out of velvet with fur trim that has definitely seen better days. It would have originally had a bunch of ribbon bows that tied on the front to hold this over your leg and shoe, but those have long since disintegrated. The interior is a quilted silk, probably has a layer of wool or flannel in there to help with warmth as well. And this was, as the name implies, originally intended to be worn by traveling women sitting in carriages where their feet would start to get awfully cold because there's certainly no heaters in carriages, and they needed something to help keep their feet warm on long travel. So again, your shoe would just slip right inside of these. The entire heel space is hollow, and shoes like this continue to be made for quite a while into the 20th century. There are plastic examples that fit over the shoe in just the same way in order to work as little rain boots, so that way you don't have to bring a whole second pair of shoes with you. Because women's shoes in this era were incredibly ingenious in the fact that they had a lot of different options that were very practical as well as very fashionable. They wanted to make sure that women had enough choices available to them that they could find something that worked for what they needed and would still keep up with the latest trends. As we've seen with quite a few of these pairs of shoes, they've seen more than their fair share of wear and use over the years, so they definitely worked very well for the people that owned them.